Hello, this is Developmental Psychology, and this is Later Adulthood to Death. And we're going to be roughly cutting into two different groups, the 60 to 75-year-old group and the over 75-year-old group. When Erik Erikson first conceived of the various life stages, there wasn't a huge population of people who lived beyond 75 to collect data on. Now there is, because people are living longer. So developmental psychologists generally sort of break this up into two groups. Okay, so what are the, first of all, psychosocial factors in becoming older? So 60 to 75 and older, the possibilities are vast now. Many people don't retire as they once did, at least in middle America, at age 60. No, I will probably work till I'm 70 or 75. That's becoming more the norm, depending on what you do for a living. But the possibilities are greater than at any other time in our history. But psychosocially, what we tend to find a great deal of comfort in as we get much older is in our families and in our daily routines. That's important to people who are older. Current events, we become news hounds on average, and in deepening friendships, which turn out to be the most loyal of the ones we have. Okay? So what are the gains and losses? Well, wisdom is a gain. The longer you live, and if you're paying attention, you become wise, all things being equal. You develop greater spiritual connections to whatever that may be. It may be to the universe, to a philosophy, to a particular set of ideas within a religion. I don't know, but those things become connected to you in a way that's different and is more substantial. Your experience gets very significant over between 40 and 60. Wow. And thereafter continues. Your integrity, your wholeness is a gain. Your position as a grandparent or a great-grandparent even is a new role that is a gain, isn't it? And you develop what you didn't know you had so much of, which is an inner and an outer strength in some ways, an inner strength certainly, and those quality relationships that I mentioned. Those are all gains. Losses, yes. Some intellectual capacities like fluid intelligence, learning new things quickly. Energy, that goes down on average. Sexual issues and problems therefrom can arise, but not for everyone. Friends and family, you lose them because they pass away, particularly parents and grandparents and so on, and maybe even siblings. Overall health, you tend to have to deal with more things, including things like arthritis and so forth. Okay? Now, there is an ageism at work in our country anyway, but not in all countries. In our country, which is individualistic, there are negative attitudes about competence and attractiveness. Worse for women than for men. Not fair. It's a misogyny. It's a systemic misogyny. But it also has to do with biological imperatives for males to find fertile females and females to find males who are able to take care of them, so people with social status. So there is some element of biology there as well that filters into psychosocial functioning. You know, there's job discrimination against older people. There's so many things, so much misinformation, really. And as I said, there's discrimination against female, and in fact, there's a discrimination in terms of income. Women don't get paid as much, and the ways that divorces and wills and all sorts of things work is women end up in worse shape, even when a male dies, on average, than when if it's a he-she relationship and they were married. She may suffer greatly. There's a disproportionate number of elderly females who are poor and Some of that has to do with not having work because of the household jobs that women have, and there is still a large group of females who are primarily the caretakers of the children in the home and so forth. Well, if they get divorced or the husband dies, you can see what could happen. So a disproportionate number of older women are poorer than older men. There's also more of them because men die younger, just women versus men. So we have something called the feminization of poverty with the addition of ageism. That's horrible. That's horrible. Think about that. Now, let's talk about what old really is. Do any delineations fit anyone, in particular? No. Does anybody have control over their own aging? You can influence it. Generally, we think of this as being a combination of physical condition, which is partly the result of what you decide to do physically and stay in shape, what you decide to eat or not eat, some of the health habits you do or don't have in terms of smoking or drinking and so on, as well as genetics. Those all contribute to physical condition. Okay. Plus psychological adjustment. So some people are more resilient to the process of a slowly declining energy and so on that they will experience. There's all sorts of factors here, aren't there? So I don't know what old is. I'm not sure. I can tell you I'm 67, and I have never been this age before, so I don't know how it goes now. Why do we age? That's an interesting question. We don't exactly know the answer. We know that cells have a limited number of times that they can divide. And in those organ systems and other places, when those cells begin to slowly stop, not all at once, but they increase in number, the ones that don't divide anymore, then you start to get failure within systems. That's the genetic programming, biological clock kind of theory. We also have a wear and tear theory that says, well, your body's like a machine and the parts wear out from internal and external stress. Yeah, that makes sense. Maybe both operate. I would say yes. Well, is there a death timer that limits these cell divisions? Is there a DNA genetic code that has a built-in time limit? Is it located in the hypothalamus or pituitary? Maybe. Maybe not. Do we suffer aging because after a long lifespan of metabolizing substances that give rise to byproducts which are in some ways poisonous to us? Is that a possibility? Essentially serving as toxins? Maybe. Okay. Well, what happens? What are some signs of this aging process? Glad you asked. So one is that we have less digestive juices. Our food is not as efficiently pushed through our system, through our alimentary canal. And so that's one of the reasons, in simple terms, why constipation is more common among older people. Yeah. Blood vessels shrink, arteries harden. There's a reduction in pumping capacity of our heart. Just to give you a statistic here, a 75-year-old and their heart pumps less than about a half of the blood it did when they were in their late 20s, early 30s. Okay. There's also a process we call peripheral as well as general slowing. So all parts of the nervous system slow down, generally due to loss of neurons. So they also don't as efficiently pass the messages down through the neural pathways as they once did. So things like decision making may be a bit slower, but it is more than made up for with wisdom. Overall processing speed slows. So the time it takes for information to be received through your senses, registered as to what we should do about that. Let's say there's a car stopping suddenly up ahead. Then that has to go down to our foot where the brake would be applied. All of that takes more time, which is why you don't want older people out at night. They don't see as well, and they take a little longer to react. Okay. So hearing, what about that? Well, there is a hearing loss. About 50% of adults over 75 have some hearing loss that's detectable and may be annoying or worse. High frequencies are the hardest to hear. That seems to affect men more than women. About 1 in 5 people who need hearing aids don't wear them. I have hearing aids. You may not know that, but I do. Crackle, crackle. Even with hearing aids, it's difficult to discern conversations when more than one person is talking. So many people, either because they didn't want to get hearing aids out of ego or cost or whatever it may be, including those that did get hearing aids, they tend to not want to be social because it's a difficult thing. It's difficult. They feel out of place and out of sync. They can't hear everything. See? So there are psychological concerns. One of the things that we see as you get older again is the cumulative losses of people that you loved and cared about. You have declining health that may contribute to psychological problems. Depression is statistically more common, though not inevitable. Anxiety can come, and depression can come from all sorts of different sources, including medications and so on. Changes in metabolism, all sorts of things. But we have to watch out for depression, which can be misdiagnosed. We sometimes think of the normal way in which aging people behave. We think, oh, well, that's just they're old. But there could actually be depression. It's associated, depression, with poor physical health. Again, many medication and medication interactions, as well as the stressors. So all those things are put together. Overall, there's a reduction in the blood flow to the brain, and the space between the cranium and the brain increases because your brain actually begins to shrink, loss of neural tissue. Yeah. Oh. And something that happens in some cases is a disease, collection of diseases called dementias. And the most common one is the Alzheimer's type, but there are others. And dementias involve problems with things like memory and language and judgment and taking care of oneself and so forth. Okay. And in the early stages of dementia, we can actually have a hard time distinguishing what's older age behavior that's normal versus what's depression versus what's a building dementia. See, now the numbers are roughly only about 10% of people over the age of 80 or so have any dementia. So it's not a prevalent. It's certainly not within the majority of people who age. No. The initial stages of dementia are memory impairment and visual spatial skills deficits. They begin to develop things like agnosia, which is the inability to recognize objects. There may be facial agnosias, which is the inability to recognize familiar faces. There may be other things that develop, including delusions of various levels, depression on the heels of the dementia, but part of it, agitation, disinhibition, aggression, apathy, lots of things, As it goes further along, dementias begin to deteriorate cognitive functioning, and eventually a person needs complete support in order to remain alive and to do daily activities. The onset of other illnesses combined with the brain problems is what brings about death from dementias. So Alzheimer's, the most common form of dementia, is something that involves a deterioration of the cerebral cortex and the hippocampus, which has to do with memory and concentration. It's more common in women than men. I don't think we know why. And what you start to see in the brain is the development of what's called amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. And you see a reduced activity of acetylcholine and an atrophy of the brain. Now, there are factors that reduce the risk of Alzheimer's, and they don't always make sense as to why, but one is don't smoke. Smoking is responsible for more problems of a wide variety of types of problems than almost anything else. There are hundreds of chemicals in tobacco, and nicotine is just one of them. Nicotine happens to be the real addicting one. So don't smoke, control your weight, treat depression, control your diabetes, improve your education, and control your blood pressure. Those are the things that appear to be related to reducing your risk for developing Alzheimer's in particular. Sleep disorders can happen. Sorry, I keep telling you about negative things, but that's the way it goes here. Insomnia is very common. Frequent awakenings, early morning awakenings, difficulty falling asleep, and the resulting daytime fatigue. Over 65, about half of all folks have some kind of chronic sleep problem. Some of these things are fixed by good sleep hygiene. Some of these are fixed by regular physical activity, moderate physical activity daily, about an hour. You have to build up to that if you haven't been exercising. Now, in older people, what you tend to see is that they lose stages 3 and 4, which are the deeper stages of sleep, and they lose the number and duration of rapid eye movement, REM, stages of sleep. Yeah. This may be the dominant way, the dominant observable way in which sleep problems are beginning. Yeah. Okay. Again, sleep hygiene is important for that. Okay, let's talk about old age and sex. Between 70 and 74, 30% of females and twice that for males are still sexually active. Between 75 and 79, 1 in 5 females and 1 in 2 males. And from 80 to 84, it's about 10% of females and about half of males. And some of that has to do with the number of males available who are not in relationships to an overabundance of females. That's partly what that statistic reveals, those statistics reveal. But interest in sex continues throughout your life, but if you allow yourself to be interested, that's partly what sex is, It's about deciding you wish to be aroused, deciding you wish to engage in closeness, and then be open to feeling sexually interested. That's part of what sex is, really, particularly when you're older. But there are changes. Older men require longer times and more stimulation to achieve and maintain erections. They require more time and greater stimulation to ejaculate. And there's a refractory period that's much longer in older males, the amount of time it takes to move from one ejaculation to another. So in 19-year-olds, that could be 10 minutes, or I don't know. Depends on the situation. New partners soon after the first one, but a day maybe. So it's different. For older people, the refractory period, hours anyway for a younger person. For an older person who's 80 years old, maybe a week. This depends. Everybody's a little bit different, For females, the vaginal lubrication is reduced following menopause on average, not for everyone. So you need an artificial lubrication. And older women return more quickly to a non-aroused state than they did before. What helps in aging in general? Well, good health. Having adequate finances. Living in an intellectually stimulating environment. Doing things that are stimulating to your brain. Being flexible in your personality as well. Letting yourself be open to different things and new things. And trying not to close down too much. Being married or connected to in some partnership with a bright person who has stimulating conversations with you. That's not surprising. And then feeling self-satisfied with your history. Okay? All right. Most older people don't want to move. They don't want to go into a retirement home or an assisted living center. Some do. Some have an easy transition to that. If they've lost a spouse. if they're with a spouse, they may be less worried about going to a place where a lot of their needs are already met for them. But for most people, that's not part of their financial picture. Most old people, for a variety of reasons, want to do what's called age in place. They want to be around the things they know and love. Because think of it this way: everything that's on your or on all your walls, in every room, and every little thing you have, everything I have, this ceramic pot has a story that I keep my pencils in. Everything around you has a story and a connection to your emotional life and your personal history. You see, so if you move into a facility, you're not at home, well, you've lost all of that. You can only take a few things with you, really. That's a big loss. That's a big bunch of losses there. We got to be empathic about that. So what people like to do, if they can, is if they live in a 2-story home, they might get one of those seats that rides up the stairs, or they move into a bedroom downstairs, or maybe they move into another house that's 1 story with no yard or whatever. But they get to take their stuff with them. You see, most people would rather just stay where they are. Of course they would. Now it turns out that most males and females, up until about 65, 70, still live with a partner. And after 70 or so, it changes a good bit. So more and more women live alone after that age because males don't live as long. And when you get over 75, you see that over half of all women are living alone. Males have partners because there's more of them that are available. So at 75 or older, 70% of males live with a partner, and only 20% live alone. Another important part of this process of aging is to get continuing education. About 1 in 4 U.S. adults over the age of 65 enroll in some kind of community education. And you can do that in a lot of different ways. You can get free but non-credit video courses from Stanford and Harvard and so on, Yale. But you can go to a local community college, and part of the role of community colleges is to supply places and programs for the community in which they are located. And so there's often great continuing ed for everyone in the community, including older people. Okay. Now, I said earlier that a lot of people do not stop working. And in fact, this is true. This is really true for places like Japan and Spain and Poland and China, where the percentage of people who are over 60 who are still in the workforce is growing very, very, very rapidly. But if you didn't continue to work for pay, you could do volunteer work. And that's important, that you contribute in a generative way to the younger generation, to the community in general. You gain personal status and community status, and it improves your self-esteem. You find new meaning in what you do in the world. Being in a religious involvement with a church is important because that gives you social connections and it gives you help when you need it. So this is the social connections associated with church involvement, religious involvement, is very, very useful. If you have a partner, that's, icing on the cake. That'd be great. If you don't, you rely on friends for your personal connections and family and children and grandchildren and so on. If you have a partner, they are the buffer against stress in the world that you can talk to, and that really is something that extends life. We know that losing a spouse is really difficult. Becoming a widow or widower means a rough go, particularly if you've been together a very long time. It's like taking a part of your life away from you. It's just very, very devastating for most people, I think. And by the way, grief never leaves you. Grief continues. but you learn to live with the loss so that it doesn't disrupt your life. Many men tend to remarry. They do it more often, more frequently than females do. But here's the deal. If men don't get remarried, there's what's called a widower effect. Men lose up to 7 years off their lifespan when they become a widower and if they don't remarry. Women lose an average of 2 years. And the reason we think that is because women have other relationships that are far deeper than men typically have with other males or females. And so women have a support network that men don't have. Men often get depressed, and the rate of depression and suicide goes up under those circumstances. Friends are about quality, not quantity, and we hope both males and females have at least one close friend that can buffer against the stressors of life. Okay, let's talk about death. So, what I want to say first is that the study of death is called thanatology. It studies the phenomenon of death, the mechanisms of death, certainly at a biological level, but also the sociological implications of death. So there are cultural aspects to death, yes? And there are psychological mechanisms that we use to cope with death. Okay? Well, what is death? Is it biological? Is it social? Is it spiritual? Is it a point of nothingness? Well, maybe it's all of them. I don't know. We always seem to not want to talk about death, but the sooner that you can accept that it's part of your lifespan, it will be something we all share, the sooner it will not frighten you anymore. So what we want is for that issue to not be something that frightens us, that dominates us in our plans for the future, that we go on and live as well as we can. But I do want to talk a little bit about the fears of people who are sick and who are dying, who are terminally ill. And one is the unknown. They don't know what's going to be next, the next moment, the next day. They're afraid of being alone and helpless. They're afraid of pain and suffering and being a burden. And they're afraid of separation from their loved ones. And they won't worry about the care that the loved ones that are left behind are going to have. And they worry about financial ruin. These are very common things. Clinically speaking, what I can tell you is that the terminally ill who are nearer death often want the following things from that list and others. And one is they don't want to be in pain, and luckily there's medication for that. And what we want to do is make sure that they feel no pain but are still awake if we can make that happen. They don't want to be afraid. Luckily we have medication, and we have therapy for that, and we have families and other people who can come and visit them. That helps. They want to be surrounded by their loved ones. That's almost invariable. And they'd rather be at home. And as a part of that, because being at home is more comfortable, they don't want to be in a hospital. No, not very many, if anybody, wants to die in a hospital. They want to be at home, but part of being at home is they don't want to be a financial burden and cost the family a fortune. I don't. So, yeah. Now, what's grief? Grief is the physical, the psychological, and the spiritual responses to the threat of a loss or the actual loss of anything, really, but in this case we're talking about a person, loss of a person. The word mourning, M-O-U-R-N-I-G, refers to the outward expressions of grief, and bereavement means just that a person is in the state of having suffered a loss. So I am the bereaved, that means I'm the person who suffered a loss. We also have something called anticipatory grief, and that means a response to the anticipated loss of oneself or in someone else that we are connected to. Okay, so if we anticipate the loss of someone who may have a terminal illness, we actually go through quite a bit of the grieving response, which is, in this case, I'm referring to emotional, ahead of time, you know? So, what are some of the common responses to the death of a loved one? Well, the inability to concentrate, to be forgetful, roller coaster of emotions, sometimes crying unconsolably, sometimes getting busy to think about something else, and making a schedule to keep themselves on track. There are lots of different responses, and there's no one right way or best way, okay? If someone is experiencing the loss of someone that they loved, just be present and be available to them. Have shorter conversations and just be around them. Let them set the tone and pace of conversations and accept anything they come out with, any kind of reaction that's emotional or anything odd or something you wouldn't think of. Don't give them advice and don't tell them everything's going to be all right. Don't do that. Don't tell them they shouldn't feel the way they feel. Allow them to express any signs of hope that they might have. Just be a support. Okay? All right. So, what is a way in which grieving can become complicated? What we sometimes call, other than a complicated grief, a morbid grieving. A sudden, unexpected death is usually connected, or is more likely to be connected. A violent death. A lengthy illness resulting in death sometimes does that. Losing a child, certainly. Thinking that the death was preventable, there was a medical error or something like that. Someone drove drunk and, yeah. Unsteady relationships. So if you had a really bad relationship with the person that died, that seems counterintuitive, but it's not, because you don't get to finish that. You don't get to fix it. You don't get to deal with it. If the person who's a survivor has any significant mental illness issues, particularly things like depression and anxiety, and then not having social support, people to be around you, take a little care of you. Okay. So a lot of this has to do with what we call integrity versus despair. So integrity means that we can look back on our lives and we can accept that we've screwed up sometimes, but we did the best we could in most cases, and it is what it is, and we accept it. And we take on new roles and relationships and responsibilities, and that's integrity. Integrity is wholeness. It's a wholeness, looking back with satisfaction. The wholeness is what drives us towards greater levels of wisdom, you see. But part of what